My heat.
Tyler,
World.
where you headed to?
I'm going to get a slice.
You going down the south?
Word.
I gotta make some deliveries and I'll check you back there, right?
On the rebound.
Bet. All right. Oh, shit. Let me check it out. That's the hype.
Newest, latest. Let me tell you the story of right hand, left hand. It's a tale of good and evil. Hey, it was with this hand that Cain iced his brother. Love. These 5 fingers, they go straight to the soul of man. The right hand, the hand of love. The story of life is this. Static. One hand is always fighting the other hand. And the left hand is kicking much ass. I mean, it looks like the right hand love is finished. But hold on, stop the presses. The right hand's coming back. Yeah, he got the left hand on the ropes now. That's right. Yeah. Ooh, it's a devastating right. And haters hurt. Down. Ooh, ooh, left hand. Hey, KO'd by love. If I love you, I love you. But if I hate you,
There it is, love and hate.
I love you.
Bet. Read Raheem, check you later. Peace.
Like the idea of homecoming, the idea of being KO'd by love, knocked out by love, dominated, vanquished by love is paradoxical. You know, instead of making it clear what it means to choose love, it makes it more complicated and confusing. It reminds me of this passage at the beginning of the James chapter where his father tells him that a man should learn to hold a gun the same way he held a woman, carefully, tenderly. Now, looking at his parents as they rode through the bush, James wondered if his father had ever held his mother that way, carefully or tenderly. Knocked out by love, it's like caressing the gun. Confused and ambivalent images of what love means. There's not a clear recipe to follow, but the problem has to do with what is described at the beginning as a distinction between a black and white world. The need to call this thing good and that thing bad, this thing white and that thing black. Was an impulse that Effie did not understand. In her village, everything was everything. Everything bore the weight of everything else. So these dichotomies, including love versus hate, are false simplifications imposed on the world, ideological simplifications imposed on the world. But I'm not sure when she says in her village everything was everything, everything bore the weight of everything else. I'm not sure how correct she is about that. After all, I think significant, the first line of dialogue in this novel is what? We will never again speak of what happened today. It's the first thing that anyone in the novel says. So that's a pretty interesting way to start a novel. We will not speak of this, and the whole subsequent novel is about speaking of it. In particular, I think it's about how suppressed speech, suppressed reality that isn't acknowledged in language gets turned into violence. A lot of this story is about sort of the language of violence. It's almost like an alternative kind of writing. It gets depicted in a very complex, very troubling image when Afia asks why she's not to reveal to anyone that she's had her period. There's a pretty deep communication of blood by way of blood going on here. How a woman's period is regulated, turns into an actual communication by way of blood. Baba reached into Effia's mouth and pulled out her tongue, pinching the tip with her sharp fingernails. Who are you that you think you can question me, eh? If you do not do as I say, I will make sure you never speak again. She released Effia's tongue, and for the rest of the night, Effia tasted her own blood. So I think it's pretty important in this book how before we even are introduced to the institution of slavery, there's a deep question about of market exchange of women. Right from the beginning, in the scene of Essie's capture, it's a scene, it's traumatic in itself. It's a scene of disrupted lovemaking by her parents. So it's a trauma in its own right. And it's a foreshadowing of unthinkable violence that's going to follow because of this capture. It's also at the same time of an occasion for Abranoma, her slave, to be reunited with her family. So it's like what's violent there. It's this topsy-turvy world, this black and white world where one person's capture turns into another person's liberation. And it's also a revelation for Essie of her mother's past trauma and a sort of trauma that she, Essie, had been living with without knowing, that had gone unacknowledged, suppressed. In fact, rather than supporting, providing her family, her mother is providing her an inheritance of violation, of not being a full person. This is very much what Hisa's mother was bequeathing to Hisa, a tradition of self-denial / mutilation. That's what Hisa's mother was passing on, in the name of not giving your baby bad thoughts. I'm going to totally deny your body and pass that on as if it's normal. A similar inheritance is explicitly named here. Essie stared at her mother then, and it was as though she were seeing her for the first time. Mame was not a whole woman. There were large swaths of her spirit missing, and no matter how much she loved Essie, and no matter how much Essie loved her, they both knew in that moment that love could never return what Mame had lost. And Essie knew too that her mother would die rather than run into the woods ever again, die before capture, die even if it meant that in her dying, Essie would inherit that unspeakable sense of loss, learn what it meant to be unwhole. This intricate ambivalence of violence and love. Mame registered earlier when she says on page 37, you can learn anything when you have to learn it. You could learn to fly if it meant you could live another day. So you learn to do what it takes to survive. It's what Abronoma learns here in this terrifying scene of singing to the sound of her whipping. She learns what it takes to survive. This time Abronoma did not cry. But Mame here isn't willing to do what it takes to survive. She can't do it anymore. I can't do it again. And so that's what she bequeaths to Essie. You're gonna have to learn what it takes to survive on your own. You're gonna have to take what violence may come. So that's what's really getting tested throughout this book, is what's worth surviving for. So a big part of this story, I think, is testing the limits of love, by breaking them. I mean, seeing how much what love can tolerate. I think part of what's at stake in these ideologies of good and evil. So we're born into the world sort of assuming that there's some order to it, that it makes sense. You know, basic promise of, civilization or human goodness. But in fact, life on this planet is just an ongoing experiment, making do with the conditions that we've inherited from the past, and there's no preordained goodness to the world. This is something we're just inventing as we go along, right? Through history. We pretend to learn from the past and try to do better, but there's no guarantee. And as I suggest, I think art, literature are ways of catching our conscious, ways of holding us to account and making the world better in that way. But, considering the slave trade here was and in significant respects remains a human catastrophe, otherwise inconceivable, worst potential of our species is realized. So one dimension of the awfulness of this has to do with an accident of geography, that there happened to be this uh, unexploited whole continent, an ocean away, for Europeans to settle and to institutionalize slavery in a way that wouldn't have been possible in Europe. That's a total accident of geography that added a dimension to human suffering in history. Essie will become similarly unwhole, broken, unable to smile. She'll pass that on to her daughter. Ness tried to smile, but she had been born during the years of Essie's unsmiling, and she had never learned how to do it quite right. So again, a real inherited trauma or disfigurement. Of course, the scene of S's capture is also the scene of the gift of the stone. And so the mother does not just bequeath her unwholeness, she also bequeaths the symbol of connection, a symbol of love, an emblem of hope and connection in the midst of violence. It couldn't be more meager, a stone. But it's as the point of the emblem is just the emblem. Like it's a sign of an aspiration for something as yet not realized, having to do with connection and love and beauty. Likewise, in Essie's story and her daughter's story, we can see hope, aspiration for love within violence, expressed in and by way of violence. It's interesting how the story of the dove of Abronima, initially the soundtrack to her torture, returns as a message, promise, false it turns out, but a message of hope. On page 84, Ness starts singing it in church unconsciously in her mother tongue, and that brings her into connection with an ally, a potential savior. And it's odd, this song of torture in church mediates this potential salvation. It makes me think of Christianity, that Savior on the cross, and torture is an emblem of salvation. Another powerful image of the intermixing of violence and love is the image of Ness and Sam having sex, conceiving Joe. Sam here is depicted in kind of godlike terms, Their bleeding, the opening of their wounds becomes an expression of their love. He runs his hands along her scabby back, and she does the same along his. And as they work together, clutching each other, some scars reopen. They are both bleeding now, both bride and bridegroom, in this unholy, holy union. I think the religious feeling here is very beautiful and loving. He picks her up like a doll to play like children play with, not in a violent way. And the rooster's crow is something else that's associated with Jesus, but here it just comes across more as a natural rhythm alongside the rhythm of their breathing into each other's mouths, sleeping together, nature waking up in the morning.